Chapter 1. Whispers and Dust. The scent of bloodroot and regret clung to the air in the healing den. It was a perfume Aria knew better than her own. Sawdust, scattered to soak up spills, crunched under her worn leather boots as she moved. She worked quietly, her fingers deft and sure as she stitched a gash on the arm of a broad-shouldered warrior named Fen. He was the third one today. He hadn't said her name once. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice soft, easily lost beneath the den's other sounds. A low whimper from a wolf with a splintered leg, the hiss of a poultice on hot stones. Fen just grunted, his eyes fixed on the den's entrance, already impatient to leave. "Heard the alpha heir is back tonight." Aria's needle paused for a fraction of a second. Kael. The name was a stone, dropping into the placid pool of her thoughts. She pulled the sinew thread tight, making a perfect, tiny knot. She didn't look up. "I heard." From the corner, two younger she-wolves, their arms laced with decorative scars from their first hunt, were sorting herbs. Their whispers were sharp and clear, meant to be overheard. "They say the moon ceremony is this week, the night of the full moon." "Finally," the other one sighed, her voice dreamy. "Kael will finally choose his mate. Can you imagine being Luna of the Shadowclaw pack? I'd wear silver in my hair every day." Her friend giggled. "He won't choose, silly. The moonstone chooses for him, but it has to be someone strong, someone worthy of standing by the fiercest alpha this pack has seen in a generation." Worthy. That word again. It was a currency Aria didn't possess. She was a healer. Useful, like a well-sharpened knife or a sturdy bowl, but never cherished. Never seen. She had learned long ago that her brand of worth was earned through service, paid for with the silent acceptance of her own invisibility. Love wasn't a gift you were given, it was a debt you paid by tending to the wounds of others, hoping one day someone might notice you were bleeding too. She finished the bandage, wrapping Fen's arm in clean linen. He flexed his fingers, testing the pull of the stitches. "It's tight," he grumbled. "It needs to be," she replied, her voice still quiet. She gathered her used supplies, her movements economical, practiced. She was a ghost in this room, a pair of hands. Fen stood, rolling his massive shoulders. He didn't thank her. They rarely did. He just nodded toward the gossiping girls. "The ceremony is the only thing anyone cares about. A strong Luna will mean strong pups. The rogues are getting bolder on the northern ridge. We need a show of strength." He looked down at her then, his gaze dismissive, as if she were a child. "You wouldn't understand the politics of it." And then he was gone, leaving behind the faint, coppery smell of his blood. Aria's shoulders slumped the moment he was out the door. The politics? Oh, she understood. She understood she was a pawn in a game she wasn't even allowed to watch. She understood that her heart, which foolishly whispered a desire for belonging, was a traitor. She ran a hand over her dark, simple braid, pushing the feeling down. Hope was a dangerous poison. Duty was the only antidote she knew. She moved to clean her workstation, her hands reaching for a clay bowl filled with a shimmering, pale paste made from ground moon petals, a rare herb used only for the deepest, most cursed wounds. It was cool to the touch. It was said to hold a sliver of the moon goddess's own magic, a forgotten myth, mostly. As her fingers brushed the rim of the bowl, it happened. A jolt. It wasn't external, not a shock from the world. It was deep inside her, a sudden, sharp pulse under her skin, like a dormant nerve had just been struck by lightning. It was fierce and possessive, an echo of a heartbeat that wasn't hers. Her breath hitched, her fingers trembled. The clay bowl slipped, hitting the packed earth floor with a crack that sounded as loud as thunder in the sudden silence of the den. The gossiping girls fell quiet, staring at her, their eyes wide with annoyance. But Aria didn't see them. She was staring at her own hand, at the skin that tingled with a strange, ancient, and terrifying hum. Her wolf. The one that had been silent since she was a pup. The one she thought was broken, had just stirred for the first time in years. and in the deepest part of her soul, she felt a terrifying premonition. The world was about to break right along with it. Chapter 2: Ice and Embers. The strange, unsettling hum beneath her skin lingered all afternoon, a low thrum of anxiety that had nothing to do with the broken bowl. It was a disquiet that settled in her bones, a note of music she'd never heard before, playing a song she didn't understand. By late afternoon, the entire pack was thrumming with a different kind of energy. A raw, restless power rippled through the air, and Aria knew what it meant even before the first shouts echoed from the edge of the clearing. He was here. She stepped out of the healing den, drawn by the commotion. The pack was gathering, their usual duties forgotten. They formed a living corridor, a path of reverence and awe. And through it, he walked. Kael Thorn. He was not like the other warriors. They were boulders, strong, solid, earthbound. He was a glacier, all sharp angles and cold, hard power, moving with a grace that was both beautiful and deadly. He was taller than the others, his shoulders broader, his black hair falling over a brow that seemed permanently fixed in a scowl of command. New scars, pale lines against his tanned skin, mapped his journey home from the rogue territories. One particularly vicious mark cut through his left eyebrow, giving his already intense gaze a predatory stillness. The pack didn't cheer. They watched in breathless, worshipful silence. He was their future, their king in all but name. Aria stayed in the shadow of the den's overhang, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She felt both drawn to the sheer power he radiated and terrified by it. He was everything she was not: seen, revered, powerful. He was the sun, and she was a speck of dust caught in a forgotten corner. His eyes, a startling pale gray like a winter sky, swept over the assembled pack. There was no warmth in them, only assessment, only control. He gave a curt nod to his father, the reigning alpha, and then his gaze continued its sweep and snagged on her. It was just for a second, a fleeting, accidental connection. But in that second, the world tilted. The hum under her skin flared into a hot, demanding buzz. It felt like her very soul was reaching for him, a desperate, foolish vine stretching toward a distant, frozen sun. He saw her. She knew he did. His expression didn't change, but something flickered deep in those icy eyes. A spark, a glint of something ancient and wild. Then his gaze slid away, dismissing her as easily as he would a loose stone in his path. The moment was over. Aria's breath came out in a shaky puff, and she quickly retreated deeper into the den's shadows, her cheeks burning with shame. What was wrong with her? Just then, 2 warriors burst into the den, carrying a third between them. "He needs a healer, now!" The injured wolf was bleeding badly from a deep gash in his side, his breaths coming in ragged pants. Adrenaline washed away Aria's confusion. She was in her element here. She pointed to a cot. "Lay him down. Gently." She went to work immediately, her hands moving with purpose. She cleaned the wound, her mind focused, her emotions locked away. This was her place. This was her worth. As she was packing the wound with moss soaked in a numbing agent, a shadow fell over her. The air grew cold. The smell of pine and ozone and something fiercely masculine filled the small space. She didn't have to look up. She knew. Kael stood just a few feet away, watching her. He said nothing. His presence was an immense weight, pressing down on her, making the air thick and hard to breathe. She could feel his gaze on her hands, on the swift, sure way she worked. She kept her own eyes down, focused on her task, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Don't look up," she told herself. "You are invisible. You are nothing." "The moon ceremony is in 3 days," he said. His voice was even deeper than she remembered. A low rumble that vibrated through the floor, through the soles of her boots, and straight into her soul. It was not a conversation. It was a declaration. A fact. She risked a glance up through her lashes. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the injured wolf, but his words felt aimed directly at her heart. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched at his sides. The control he projected was absolute, but she saw it then, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand, a crack in the glacier. His wolf, the legendary Fenrir she'd only heard stories about, was fighting him from the inside. It was reacting. To the blood? Or to something else? To her? Before she could process the thought, his father, Alpha Valerius, appeared at the entrance. "Kael, the elders are waiting." Kael's face hardened, the mask of pure control slamming back into place. He gave the wounded warrior one last unreadable look and then turned and walked away without another word. The cold pressure in the den receded with him, leaving Aria feeling strangely hollow and breathless. As Alpha Valerius followed his son out, he stopped and addressed the pack members lingering nearby, his voice booming with authority. "Let it be known. 3 days from now, under the light of the full moon, the goddess will reveal the one who is destined to be mate to my son, Kael. The future Luna of this pack will be named." The pack erupted in excited murmurs. Names were whispered. Bets were placed. The future was a thrilling game to them. But for Aria, it was a death sentence. The hum in her blood was no longer a quiet thrum. It was a scream, and it was screaming a name that terrified her more than any rogue in the forest. Kael. Chapter 3. The Moon's Mistake. 3 days passed in a blur of nervous energy. The entire pack vibrated with anticipation, a collective holding of breath. For Aria, it felt like an executioner's countdown. The hum in her blood had become a constant, a low, insistent song that pulled her toward a fate she did not want. It was a terrifying magnetic tide, and she was a swimmer with no strength left to fight it. Tonight was the night. The clearing was bathed in the ethereal silver light of a full moon so bright it washed the color from the world, leaving everything in shades of pearl and obsidian. The air was cold, smelling of damp earth, pine, and the ozone crackle of raw magic. In the center of the clearing stood the moonstone, a massive, unblemished pillar of what looked like polished obsidian. But it wasn't rock. It was something older, something that seemed to drink the moonlight and breathe it back out as a faint, pulsing glow. The entire Shadowclaw pack was gathered around it, their faces upturned, their expressions a mix of reverence and excitement. Aria tried to make herself small at the back of the crowd, her simple homespun tunic a stark contrast to the leathers and furs worn by the others. She kept her head down, her heart a wild bird trapped in her ribs. "Let it not be me," she prayed to a goddess she wasn't sure even listened. "Please. Anyone but me." To be chosen was to be seen by him was to be destroyed. Alpha Valerius stood before the stone, his arms raised. "Tonight," his voice boomed, silencing the crowd. "We honor the traditions of our ancestors. We honor the moon goddess who gives us our strength, our spirit, and our mates. Tonight, we ask her to bless this pack with a Luna worthy of our future Alpha." He gestured to Kael, who stepped forward. He was dressed in black ceremonial leathers, the moonlight catching the silver clasps at his shoulders. He looked less like a wolf and more like a god of winter, beautiful, remote, and unforgiving. He placed his hand on the moonstone. The stone's gentle glow flared. It pulsed with a steady, powerful rhythm like a great heart awakening. The light intensified, swirling inside the stone. Aria watched, mesmerized and terrified. The light was searching. It was a living thing, a tendril of fate seeking its match. The beam of light solidified, lashing out from the stone and enveloping Kael in a column of pure, white energy. A collective gasp went through the pack. The first connection was made. Now for the second. The light inside the stone swirled again, faster this time. Aria squeezed her eyes shut. Not me, not me, not me. The hum in her blood roared, a deafening crescendo. It was no longer a pull. It was a physical chain, yanking her soul forward. A second beam of light, slender but just as bright, shot from the stone. It cut through the crowd like an arrow. It did not land on the strong warrior maiden at the front. It did not choose the daughter of a respected elder. It flew straight and true to the back of the pack, to the healer who was trying to hide in the shadows. It struck Aria. The light was not hot. It was warm, like a lover's touch, and it bathed her in a silver aura. The world fell away. There was only the light, the thrumming in her veins, and the man standing across the clearing, bound to her by a cord of undeniable destiny. For one single, insane moment, as she looked at Kael through the shimmering curtain of magic, a fragile hope bloomed in her chest, a stupid, impossible hope that maybe she could be worthy after all. The pack was dead silent. The shock was a palpable thing. Kael stared at her, his face a mask of stone. The light connected them, a bridge of fate between the powerful alpha heir and the nobody healer. He looked at her as if she were a snake that had just crawled onto his path. There was no recognition, no acceptance, only disbelief, quickly hardening into something colder, something cruel. He slowly pulled his hand from the stone. He took a step forward into the center of the clearing, his shadow long and sharp in the moonlight. He raised his chin, his voice ringing out with the force of a glacier cracking in two. "I, Kael Thorn, son of Valerius, future alpha of the Shadowclaw," he began, his words precise and sharp. "Reject this pairing." The silver light connecting them flickered, as if in pain. "The moon goddess has made a mistake." His final words struck her like a physical blow. Mistake. The word echoed in the clearing, followed by the sound of the magical light shattering into a million fading motes of dust. The fragile hope in her chest didn't just die. It was murdered. And then came the second blow, worse than the first. A low chuckle from someone in the crowd, then another. Soon, the clearing was filled with the sound of their laughter, cruel, mocking, dismissive. The sound of her deepest fears being proven true. She wasn't just unworthy, she was a joke. Aria didn't feel herself move. Her legs just ran. She turned from the ceremony, from the laughter, from the cold, dismissive eyes of the man who was supposed to be her destiny, and she fled into the dark embrace of the forest. The sounds of their amusement chased her, biting at her heels. She stumbled over a root, her body and spirit finally giving out. She fell to her knees on the damp earth hidden by the shadows of ancient trees. A single tear, hot and heavy with a lifetime of loneliness, finally escaped and traced a path down her cold cheek. And as it fell, a searing pain, sharp and clean as a hot needle, pierced the skin of her chest right over her heart. She gasped, clutching the spot. There was no mark, no blood, but she could feel it under her skin, a new, burning, invisible brand, a seal of rejection, a promise of pain. Fate had been denied, and the curse was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Mark of a Dream. Sleep was not an escape. It was a trap. Aria found herself in a forest made of moonlight and silence. The trees were impossible things, their bark shimmering like polished silver, their leaves whispering secrets the waking world never could. The air was cool and smelled of night-blooming flowers and something wild, something ancient. She was not afraid. In this place, the shame from the ceremony couldn't touch her. Here, she felt a strange sense of belonging, as if she had come home to a place she'd never known. A massive black wolf emerged from between the silver trees. It was larger than any wolf she had ever seen, its fur the color of a starless midnight sky. It moved with a liquid grace, its paws making no sound on the mossy ground. It stopped a few feet from her, and when it lifted its head, she saw its eyes. They were not the golden amber of a normal wolf. They were a startling, familiar gray, a winter sky, Kael's eyes. Her heart didn't pound with fear. It ached with a deep, sorrowful recognition. The great wolf padded closer, its presence radiating a possessive heat that warmed the cool air. It nudged her hand with its wet nose, and the touch was a jolt of pure energy. It lowered its massive head and looked at her shoulder, its gaze intense, questioning. Then, slowly, deliberately, it opened its powerful jaws. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. It felt right, inevitable. The wolf's teeth closed over the curve of her shoulder, just above her collarbone. There was no pain, only a firm, definite pressure, a claiming. It was not an act of violence, but an act of branding, a soul-deep signature being written on her skin. The world seemed to hum with the finality of it, the silver light of the forest pulsing in time with her own heartbeat. The wolf held her for a long moment, its warm breath ghosting across her neck before it finally let go and faded back into the shimmering trees, leaving her alone in the silent, silver wood. Aria woke with a gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat. Her thin blanket was tangled around her legs, and the pale gray light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the cracks in the den's walls. "A dream," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Her hand flew to her shoulder, pressing against the fabric of her tunic. It had to be a dream, a nightmare, born from the humiliation she had suffered. Her mind was playing tricks on her, punishing her for the foolish hope she had allowed to bloom. She sat up, shivering, trying to shake the phantom feeling of the wolf's teeth from her memory. It felt so real. A dull, persistent itch started on her shoulder. She frowned, scratching at it through the rough cloth. It was probably just a bug bite, nothing more. But the itch grew into a strange, tingling ache. With trembling fingers, she pulled the worn collar of her tunic to the side, baring her skin to the faint morning light. She stopped breathing. It wasn't a bug bite. It wasn't a rash. It wasn't a figment of her imagination. There, on her skin, were the faint, crescent-shaped bruises and tiny red pinpricks of teeth marks. A perfect, undeniable impression of a wolf's jaw. It was exactly where the dream wolf had bitten her. A wave of nausea and terror washed over her. She scrambled off her cot, stumbling over to the small, polished shard of obsidian she used as a mirror. She held it up, her hand shaking so badly the reflection wavered. But the marks were there. They were real. She was not going mad. This was worse. So much worse. The rejection, the laughter, the shame. That had been an ending. This was something else entirely. This was a beginning. The bond that he had publicly denied, the connection the moon goddess had forged. It was real, and it was refusing to die. It was clawing its way out of dreams and into her waking life, marking her body as its own. He had rejected her before the entire pack, but some part of him, his wolf, his soul, was refusing to let her go. And that was a thought more terrifying than any public humiliation. Chapter 5. The Alpha's Cage. Kael stood in the icy river that cut through their territory, the pre-dawn water rushing past his waist. Cold was supposed to bring clarity. It was supposed to numb. But it did nothing to silence the beast that raged inside his mind. He plunged his head under the surface, the shock of it a welcome punishment. He came up sputtering, gasping for air, but the voice was still there. Mine. It was a low growl that vibrated in his very bones. It wasn't his own thought. It belonged to Fenrir, the wolf that shared his soul. "She is nothing," Kael gritted out, his words turning to vapor in the frigid air. He was alone, but he was arguing for his life, for his sanity. Liar. The voice was mocking, ancient. You felt it, the string that ties our soul to hers. You saw the light. The goddess does not make mistakes. "It was a mistake!" Kael roared, slamming his fist into the water, sending a spray of icy droplets into the air. He had spent his entire life building a fortress of control around himself. Duty, strength, power. Those were the things that mattered. Emotion was a weakness, a vulnerability he could not afford, especially not now with rogue packs testing their borders and whispers of a larger threat growing in the shadows. And this girl, this healer, she was the biggest threat of all. She was chaos. She was a weakness he hadn't known he possessed until he saw her standing in that silver light. "You want her?" Fenrir taunted. "The scent of her, like moon petals and clean earth. Our wolf aches for her. You ache for her. I ache for control, Kael snarled. He hauled himself out of the river, his body numb but his mind on fire. The dream had been his undoing. He'd had it too. The same silver forest, the same quiet girl with eyes that held a universe of unspoken pain. He'd watched himself, a passenger in his own body, as his wolf claimed her, marked her. He had woken with the phantom taste of her skin on his tongue and a savage, possessive satisfaction that terrified him to his core. Later that morning, he stood with his father in the strategy tent, a map of their territory spread between them. Alpha Valerius tapped a claw-like finger on the northern ridge. The rogues are becoming more organized. They struck a patrol yesterday. Sloppy, but bold. We need to make a show of force. I'll lead a party myself, Kael said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was his shield. Valerius grunted his approval. Then his eyes narrowed, a flicker of contempt in them. This is a distraction we don't need. All this talk of the ceremony, and that healer girl's little spectacle. Running away like a frightened rabbit. She's a weakling. A disgrace. Kael's jaw tightened. He forced the words out, each one a betrayal to the beast clawing at the inside of his ribs. She is unimportant. Pain. Blinding and white-hot, it exploded in his chest, right over his heart. He gasped, stumbling back a step, his hand flying to the spot. It felt like someone had driven a burning spear through him. Kael? His father asked, his voice sharp with concern. What is it? Nothing, Kael choked out, straightening up through sheer force of will. The pain subsided to a dull, throbbing ache. A muscle cramp. He knew it was a lie. The curse wasn't just in his mind. It was in his flesh. Every time he denied her, every time he lied about the bond, it would punish him. It was a chain, and the more he fought against it, the deeper its hooks would sink into his soul. His fortress of control had a traitor within its walls. He had to find her, not because his wolf demanded it, not because of some foolish destiny. He had to find her because he had to understand the rules of this curse that was tearing him apart. He had to find her so he could figure out how to sever this bond for good. He was the alpha heir. He controlled his fate. He would not be chained to a weak, insignificant healer. He turned to leave the tent, his resolve a thin sheet of ice over a raging sea. He would end this. He had to. But as he stepped out into the daylight, he caught his reflection in a polished shield hanging by the entrance. And for a terrifying instant, the eyes that stared back at him were not his own winter gray. They were the burning, golden eyes of a hungry wolf. Chapter 6. Where Monsters Dwell. The marks on Aria's shoulder had not faded. If anything, the pale bruises had deepened into a faint, purplish shadow against her skin, a constant, aching reminder of a dream that refused to die. She had spent 2 days in self-imposed exile, hiding in the healing den, pleading illness. But she couldn't hide forever. The shame was a physical weight, but the fear of what the marks meant was a far heavier burden. She had to get rid of them. She had to erase the proof that her mind, her body, and her very soul were betraying her. There was only one thing she could think of: shadow moss, a rare, difficult herb that was rumored to fade even the most stubborn of scars. It grew only in the damp, dark places of the northern woods near the Whisperwood Caves. Rogue territory. Going there alone was foolish. It was a death wish. But the thought of someone else discovering the marks on her skin was a fate worse than death. So she went. She moved through the forest like a ghost, her senses on high alert. The woods here were different. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangled overhead, blocking out the sun. The air was heavy and still. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through her. She clutched the handle of the small herb knife at her belt, though she knew it would be little use against a feral rogue. She found a patch of the dark velvety moss growing at the base of a fallen log near a cave entrance. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. She knelt, pulling out her knife, and began to carefully scrape the moss into a leather pouch. She was so focused on her task, so desperate to get what she came for and leave, that she didn't hear the footsteps until they were almost on top of her. A twig snapped, loud, close. Aria froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She slowly rose to her feet, turning toward the sound. It was not a rogue. It was a monster of a different kind. Kael stood at the edge of the clearing, his expression dark and stormy. He looked worse than she had ever seen him. The usual ironclad control was gone, replaced by a raw, frayed intensity. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his jaw was covered in a rough stubble, as if he hadn't slept or cared to groom himself. He looked like a man who was being hunted from the inside out, and the sight of him sent a fresh wave of terror through her. "What are you doing here?" he growled. The sound was low, guttural, and it vibrated in the heavy air between them. Aria flinched, instinctively hiding the pouch of moss behind her back. I was gathering herbs." His eyes narrowed, sweeping over her, and his gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. "You're lying. This is rogue territory. You shouldn't be here." As he took a step closer, the marks on her shoulder began to burn. It was a hot, insistent sting, a fire under her skin. She winced, a small gasp escaping her lips. At the exact same moment, she saw him flinch, his own hand moving to clutch his chest, his face twisting in a brief spasm of pain. Their eyes met, and in that moment, there was no hiding. He knew. He felt it too. This curse, this chain, it bound them both in a prison of shared torment. The air between them crackled with a tension that was part hate, part fear, and part something else. Something hot and electric that neither of them dared to name. "This bond," he began, his voice a strained whisper. "What is it doing to you?" Before she could answer, before she could even breathe, a snarl ripped through the clearing. It came not from Kael, but from the shadows of the cave. Two figures detached themselves from the darkness. They were rogues, their bodies gaunt and wiry, their eyes glowing with a feral, hungry light. Their clothes were tattered, their teeth bared in a silent promise of violence, and their hungry eyes were locked directly on her. One of them lunged, its movements unnaturally fast. It was a blur of matted fur and sharp claws. Aria screamed, stumbling backward, her small knife feeling utterly useless. This was it. This was how she died. But the rogue never reached her. In a movement so fast it seemed to defy physics, Kael was there. He moved not like a man, but like a storm. He shoved her hard behind him, putting his body between her and the danger. The rogue's claws, meant for her, tore across Kael's arm instead. Blood, dark and red, flew into the air. The coppery scent of it was thick and overwhelming. The instant his blood was spilled for her, something violent and primal ignited between them. The burning in her shoulder exploded into a raging inferno. A growl ripped from Kael's chest, a sound so deep, so savage, so utterly inhuman, that the entire forest seemed to fall silent in fear. He turned to face the rogues, and in the dim light of the woods, Aria saw his eyes flash from icy gray to a brilliant, terrifying gold. Chapter 7. Bound by Blood. The fight was over in a blur of savage fury. Kael moved with a speed that wasn't entirely human, a dark storm of controlled violence. He didn't just defeat the two rogues, he dismantled them, his movements economical and utterly lethal. The feral light in their eyes guttered out, leaving only a shocked emptiness. Aria stood frozen, her small herb knife clutched in her hand, her mind struggling to reconcile the monster she'd just witnessed with the man whose face it wore. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of Kael's ragged breaths. He stood over the fallen rogues, his chest heaving, the blood from his wounded arm dripping onto the forest floor. He slowly turned to face her. The terrifying gold of his eyes receded like a dying fire, leaving behind the familiar cold gray. He looked down at his own arm, then back at her, a flicker of confusion in his expression. "Your eyes," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Stay out of it," he snarled. but the command lacked its usual force. He was shaken. He was looking at her as if she were the source of the strange power that had just surged through him. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but a deeper instinct, the healer's instinct, rose to the surface. He was bleeding. He was her packmate. That was a truth simpler than curses and destiny. "Sit down," she ordered, her voice surprisingly steady. For a moment she thought he would refuse, that the alpha heir would snap at her for her audacity. But he just stared at her, a strange, haunted look on his face. And then he slowly sank to the ground, leaning his back against a moss-covered rock. The silence between them was a living thing as she worked. She tore a strip from the hem of her tunic and knelt beside him, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She cleaned the wound, her fingers brushing against the hot, firm skin of his arm. The contact was electric. A jolt went through her, and she saw him flinch, his muscles tightening under her touch. The faint marks on her shoulder began to burn with a low, insistent heat, and she knew, from the rigid set of his jaw, that he felt the same fire in his own chest. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his gaze unwavering, tracking the movement of her fingers as she packed the wound with the shadow moss she had gathered and bound it tightly. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the terrifying new reality that bound them together. She was acutely aware of his scent, pine, ozone, and the raw, masculine smell of him, and the sheer physical power he held in check. When she was finished, she pulled back, keeping her eyes down. "It will hold until we get back." She started to gather her spilled herbs, her hands trembling slightly. She noticed a small, shallow scratch on the back of her own hand, beaded with a line of red. She must have gotten it during the scuffle, when he'd pushed her. It stung, but it was insignificant. That night, sleep offered no respite. It dragged her back to the silver forest. The massive black wolf was there, waiting for her. It padded over to her and nudged her, its winter-gray eyes soft with a strange, sorrowful light. It then lay down, lifting its great front paw. Aria saw a small, shallow scratch on the top of it, oozing a phantom, silvery blood. The wolf began to lick the wound, its long tongue gentle and methodical. Aria woke with a start, her heart pounding. The dream had been so vivid. She sat up, and in the dim light of her den, she happened to glance at her hand. She froze. The scratch. It was gone. Not healing, not scabbed over. It was simply gone, leaving behind smooth, unmarked skin. A cold, terrifying understanding washed over her. It wasn't just a shared dream. It wasn't just a mental connection. Whatever happened to him, happened to her. Whatever happened to his wolf in that other world, happened to her body in this one. They were linked, inseparably. And as she stared at her miraculously healed skin, a new sound entered the silence of her mind. It was a whisper, faint and fragile as a moth's wing, but it was there. It was not the goddess. It was not Kael. It was something else. Something that felt like it belonged to her. "Heal," it whispered. "Grow." It was the first stirring of her own wolf, awakening from its long slumber, and it was a voice she was not sure she wanted to hear. Chapter 8. The Storm and the Stillness. They had just started the long, silent walk back to the packlands when the sky turned against them. The air grew heavy and humid, the light fading to a bruised, greenish gray. The wind began to moan through the trees, a low, mournful sound that promised violence. Then the heavens split open. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid, wind-whipped sheets. It was a cold, brutal deluge that soaked them to the bone in seconds and turned the forest floor into a churning river of mud. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, followed by claps of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very roots of the mountains. "Back to the cave!" Kael shouted over the roar of the storm, grabbing her arm. His touch was a brand even through her wet tunic. He didn't wait for a response, simply pulled her along, his strength easily overcoming her stumbling attempts to keep up. They scrambled back into the dark, narrow mouth of the cave they had just left, dripping and shivering. The storm raged outside, a wall of noise and fury that cut them off from the rest of the world. They were trapped, alone, together. The cave was small, barely more than a hollow in the rock. The darkness was almost absolute, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and their own wet bodies. The temperature plummeted, and a deep, penetrating chill began to set in. Aria wrapped her arms around herself, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. After a long, tense silence, Kael moved. She heard him shifting, a rustle of wet leather. "We'll freeze if we stay on opposite sides," he said, his voice a low rumble that was somehow more intimidating than the thunder outside. It was not a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. He sat down with his back against the rock wall, and then, after a moment's hesitation, he reached out and pulled her down to sit beside him. The contact was shocking. His body was a furnace, a startling source of heat in the encroaching cold. He was tense, every muscle in his body as tight as a coiled spring, but he didn't let go. He drew her closer until her back was pressed against his chest. Her mind screamed at her to pull away, to run. But her body, cold and trembling, betrayed her. It leaned into his warmth, craving the heat, the solidness of him. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. She could feel every breath he took. The line between fear and something else, something terrifyingly new, began to blur. This was her fated mate, the man whose rejection had shattered her world, and he was holding her as if he was protecting her from the storm. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The only sounds were the roar of the rain and the soft, ragged sound of their breathing. The initial tension slowly began to melt away, replaced by a thick, heavy awareness. His scent enveloped her, overwhelming her senses. He smelled of rain, of pine, and of a deep, musky maleness that called to something primal within her. He shifted, turning her slightly so she was tucked against his side. His wounded arm was a barrier between them, but the rest of him was pressed against her. He lowered his head, his face close to hers in the darkness, and she could feel his warm breath ghosting across her cheek. "Aria," he whispered. Her name was a sound of pure agony. It was a question, a plea, and a curse all in one. His wolf was close to the surface. She could feel its power radiating from him, a wild, possessive energy that made the air hum. It wanted out. It wanted her. He dipped his head lower, his lips brushing the sensitive skin of her neck, and she felt the sharp, shocking graze of his teeth against her pulse point. Aria's breath hitched. Her body went rigid. A war raged inside her, terror versus a shocking, traitorous wave of pure, liquid heat that pooled low in her belly. Part of her, a wild and foolish part, wanted to tilt her head, to grant him the access he craved. No. The word was ripped from him, a raw, guttural sound of a man tearing himself in two. He pulled back so sharply, he hit his head against the cave wall with a dull thud. He scrambled away from her, putting as much distance as the small space would allow. He sat on the far side of the cave, a rigid silhouette of pure self-loathing, his back to her. The sudden absence of his heat was a cold, lonely shock. He didn't say another word, leaving her trembling in the darkness, her heart hammering with the terrifying knowledge of what had almost just happened. Chapter 9. The Goddess's Price. The storm finally broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world that was washed clean and unnervingly quiet. The journey back to the Packlands was a torment of strained silence. The memory of the cave, the heat of his body, the scrape of his teeth on her skin, his agonized denial, hung between them like a tangible thing. It was a shared secret, a dangerous acknowledgement of the fire that burned beneath the ice of his rejection. Aria felt changed. The clear lines of her world had been blurred. He was the man who had publicly shamed her, yet he had also instinctively protected her, shared his warmth with her, and fought a war with himself for her. Her fear of him was now tangled up with a confusing, frightening tendril of something else, something that felt dangerously like desire. She stumbled back to her empty healing den, her body and soul aching with a weariness so profound it felt like an illness. She didn't even bother to change out of her damp clothes, simply collapsing onto her cot and letting the heavy, dreamless dark pull her under. But her sleep was not dreamless. She was not in the silver forest this time. She stood on a floor of polished black glass that reflected a sky swimming with a billion cold, unblinking stars. There was no sound, no wind, only a vast cosmic silence. A figure coalesced from the starlight before her. It was a woman, tall and regal, her form woven from moonlight and nebulae, her hair a flowing river of silver light. Her face was beautiful, but it was a terrifying, inhuman beauty, and her eyes held the calm, ancient wisdom of eternity. She knew with a certainty that went deeper than knowledge that she was standing before the moon goddess, Aria Vale. Child of the forgotten line, the goddess spoke, but her voice was not sound. It was pure thought blooming directly inside Aria's mind, cool and clear as chiming glass. Aria wanted to kneel, to run, to speak, but she could do nothing but stand there, a tiny, mortal speck in the face of divinity. You seek to understand the bond I have forged. You feel its pull. You fear its power. The goddess's expression was unreadable, neither kind nor cruel. It was simply absolute. Know this. The bond is not a curse. It is a key. It was created to heal a wound in the Shadowclaw bloodline, a darkness that has festered for generations. A flicker of hope ignited in Aria's chest. A key? A cure? But every cure has its price, the goddess continued, and the starlight around her seemed to dim, to grow colder. The mark I have placed upon your two souls is a vessel. When you are near, when the bond is strong, it draws the ancient poison from his blood and into itself. It purifies him. This was good, wasn't it? Aria thought, her mind reeling. This was why he was losing control, why his wolf was so close to the surface. The bond was healing him. The vessel must be sealed, the goddess's voice intoned, each word a shard of ice in Aria's soul. It can only be sealed by an act of true, selfless love. Not by duty, not by lust, but by a heart that is willing to give everything for another. When and if you complete this bond, when you mark each other as true mates, the darkness will be purged from his line forever. Aria's fragile hope began to tremble, sensing the horrifying truth that was coming next. And his life will be the final payment. The words struck Aria with the force of a physical blow. His life will be the final payment. To cleanse his soul, your love must extinguish his life, the goddess clarified, her voice devoid of pity. That is the price. That has always been the price. Choose wisely, little healer. The black glass floor dissolved beneath her feet, and Aria woke up with a silent scream caught in her throat. She was back in her cot, the gray morning light filtering into the den. But the cold of the starry abyss was still in her bones. The goddess's words were branded on her soul. The confusing warmth she had felt in the cave, the flicker of desire, the whisper of a question, it all vanished, burned away by a horrifying absolute certainty. The bond wasn't a curse on her. It was a loaded gun pointed directly at Kael's heart. And the trigger was her love. She sat up, a single cold tear tracing a path down her cheek. She finally understood. Her goal could no longer be to simply escape him. She had to save him, and the only way to save him from the cure was to run so far away that love would never have a chance to bloom. Chapter 10. The Beast Awakens. The decision to run was a cold, hard stone in her gut. Every step Aria took away from the Packlands felt like a betrayal of a home she'd never truly had, but the goddess's warning echoed with every beat of her heart. His life will be the final payment. Love was a weapon aimed at his chest, and she was the one holding it. Fleeing was not an act of cowardice. It was the only act of mercy she had left to give. She carried a small leather pouch with a few dried herbs and a water skin, sticking to the overgrown game trails that snaked along the base of the mountains. It was slower, but safer. Or so she thought. She was in a narrow ravine, the rock walls rising on either side, when they appeared. 3 of them. Rogues. They blocked the path ahead and behind, their movements synchronized, their eyes holding a cunning that the previous attackers had lacked. They weren't just feral, they were organized. Well, well, the leader sneered, a deep scar puckering his lip. Look what we found, the Alpha's little mistake. Aria's blood ran cold. How did they know that? Heard he threw you away in front of everyone. Another one chuckled, his laugh a dry, rasping sound. Must sting, to be chosen by the goddess, only to be tossed aside like trash. They circled her slowly, like vultures sizing up their meal. Her hand went to the small knife at her belt, but she knew it was a useless gesture. These were seasoned killers. She was a healer. Don't worry, the leader said, his eyes glinting with a cruel light. We'll give you a purpose. We're going to send a message to that arrogant pup Kael. We'll deliver you back to him. In pieces. That was it. The final thread of her control snapped. It wasn't just her life on the line. They were going to use her, even in death, to hurt him, to hurt the pack. All her life she had been invisible, a tool to be used and discarded. And now these animals were going to do the same. A hot, furious rage, unlike anything she had ever felt, surged through her veins. The faint, moth-wing whisper of her wolf in the back of her mind was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. Enough. The first rogue lunged. Aria didn't think. She reacted. Her body moved with a speed and strength that was not her own. She ducked under his swiping claws, her small knife flashing out, not in a clumsy stab, but in a precise deadly arc that sliced across the tendons behind his knee. He howled and collapsed. The second one came at her, his jaw unhinged in a snarl. She didn't retreat. She advanced, a guttural cry tearing from her own throat. She dropped the knife and met his charge, her hands catching his wrists. There was a sickening, wet crack as the bones in his arms snapped under the impossible pressure of her grip. He stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and pain, before she shoved him back, sending him crashing into the ravine wall. The leader watched, his sneer gone, replaced by a dawning horror. What are you? Aria didn't answer. She was barely aware of herself anymore. She was pure instinct, pure, unadulterated fury. A faint, silvery light shimmered around her hands, a power she didn't recognize but wielded as if she'd been born to it. She was the predator now. She was the monster. The fight was brutal, short, and bloody. When it was over, she stood in the center of the ravine, her chest heaving, her knuckles raw and bleeding. The 3 rogues lay still on the ground around her. The metallic scent of blood was thick in the air. The feral rage receded, draining away as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a cold, nauseating shock. She looked at her hands, at the blood that wasn't hers. She looked at the bodies. I did this. The thought was a shard of ice in her soul. A shadow fell over her. Kael stood at the entrance to the ravine, his sword half drawn. He must have been tracking her. He took in the scene, the dead rogues, the blood, and her, standing in the middle of the carnage. His face was a mask of disbelief. He wasn't looking at the bodies. He was staring at her, at the faint residual shimmer of starlight that still clung to her skin like an afterimage. His eyes widened, a dawning, impossible realization in their depths. He took a step forward, his voice a raw, stunned whisper. Witch. Chapter 11. The Witch's Diary. The walk back was a blur of silent shock. Kael didn't speak, his gaze constantly flicking to her as if seeing her for the first time. He radiated a new kind of tension, not just the coiled anger she was used to, but a deep, unnerving confusion. He left her at the entrance to her den with a single gruff command to stay put, before striding away, undoubtedly to report the rogue attack to his father. Alone in the familiar quiet of her den, Aria's body began to tremble. The foreign power that had flooded her veins was gone, leaving behind an aching hollowness. She looked at her bloody hands, the evidence of her monstrous strength, and felt a wave of self-revulsion. What was she? What had she done? The faint hum of magic, the same energy she'd felt flare to life in the ravine, still lingered within her. It wasn't a voice anymore. It was a pull. A gentle but insistent tug, drawing her attention to a corner of the den she'd swept 1,000 times. There, beneath her cot, was a single floorboard whose edges seemed just a little too perfect, whose grain didn't quite match the others. Her heart pounding, she knelt and pried it up with the tip of her knife. Beneath it lay a dark, hollow space, and nestled inside was a small, rectangular package wrapped in oilskin. It was heavy, and smelled faintly of old leather and dried herbs. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped it. It was a journal. Her mother's. She opened the worn leather cover. The pages were filled with her mother's elegant, looping script. The words she read rewrote her entire life. Her mother, Ilara, had not been a simple pack healer. She was a witch, from a long and hidden line, born with a unique and terrible power, a curse that dampened the magic of others. Fearing her nature would make her an outcast, she had hidden it, living a quiet life on the fringes of the pack. She had fallen in love with a Shadowclaw warrior, Aria's father, but had never told him the full truth of what she was. Her curse was why Aria's own wolf had been dormant, suppressed from birth by her mother's proximity, but it was the next part that made Aria's breath catch in her throat. Her mother had used her witch sight to study the pack's history and had discovered the Thorn family's dark secret. Generations ago, the first Alpha Thorn had made a pact with a shadow entity for unmatched power, allowing a corrupting darkness to enter his bloodline. This darkness was passed down, from father to son, driving each Alpha closer to a feral madness, a tyranny that would eventually consume the pack. Kael's coldness, his obsessive need for control, it wasn't just his personality. It was a battle against the darkness within. The moon goddess sees, her mother had written. She does not create curses, but she will forge a key. She sought a healer, not just of the body, but of the blood. A witch wolf. One whose dampening curse could be inverted. One whose blood could purify the other. The bond wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a random pairing, it was the goddess's desperate, last-ditch effort to save the Shadowclaw pack from its own leaders. The death Aria had been warned of wasn't a certainty. It was the ultimate risk of the ritual. If the purification failed, it would consume them both. The world tilted on its axis. She was not a mistake. She was the cure. She was still reeling, the journal clutched in her hands, when a shadow fell across the entrance of her den. She looked up, expecting Kael. It was a stranger. He was tall and lean, with hair the color of sun-bleached sand and eyes as green as the forest in spring. He wore the insignia of the Silvermoon Pack, their closest rivals. He moved with an easy, confident grace, and his smile was warm and disarming. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "My patrols reported a disturbance near the border. I saw what you did. That was remarkable." Aria scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding with a new kind of alarm. "I am Alpha Lucien of the Silvermoon," he continued, his kind eyes taking in the sparse den, her simple clothes, and the haunted look on her face. "And I have been watching the Shadowclaw for some time. I see the darkness in its Alpha, and the coldness in his son. I see how they treat their people." His gaze softened. "A wolf with a spirit as fierce as yours does not belong in a place where she is not cherished." He took a step closer, not threateningly, but with an offer of gentle sincerity. "My pack values strength, yes, but we also value heart. I can offer you sanctuary, a place where you would be honored, not overlooked." He held out his hand. A way out. Chapter 12. The Spiral. The training yard was a wreck of splintered wood and scattered straw. Kael didn't feel the splinters digging into his knuckles. He didn't feel the burn in his muscles. All he felt was a black, churning rage. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, standing in the entrance of her den, talking to him. To Lucienne. The Silver Moon Alpha had looked at her with an expression of open admiration, and a possessive, primal fury had clawed its way up Kael's throat, so potent it had almost choked him. He slammed his fist into what was left of a wooden training dummy, shattering the post. "She is ours," Fenrir snarled in his mind. The wolf's voice was stronger now, no longer a whisper he could fight, but a roar that echoed in the hollows of his soul. But there was another voice, too, a newer one. It was colder, more insidious. It was the darkness his mother's diary had spoken of. "The witch blood weakens you," it hissed, its words like venom. "She is not a cure. She is a poison. Look how she invites our enemies to our doorstep. She will control you with her magic, pull you down, and give your power to another." He stumbled back, clutching his head. The two voices were tearing him apart. Fenrir's was a primal, possessive need to protect and claim. The other was a cold, paranoid poison that whispered of betrayal and destruction. He saw a flash of it then. A vision. Him, standing over Aria in a moonlit clearing. Her eyes, wide with terror and betrayal. His own hands, his own claws, dripping with her blood. The image was so vivid, so real, he cried out, falling to his knees. This was the madness his ancestors had succumbed to. The bond, meant to heal him, was instead aggravating the darkness, forcing a war inside him that he was losing. He was becoming the monster. He was the threat. He had to stay away from her. The thought was a physical agony, a tearing of his soul, but it was the only clear thought he had. He had to keep her safe, from himself. He locked himself in his quarters, refusing food, refusing to see anyone. He paced the floor like a caged animal, fighting the visions that assaulted him, battling the voices that screamed in his head. Guilt and rage and terror consumed him. He was breaking. Days blurred into a feverish haze. He was losing. The darkness was winning. Then, one of his most trusted sentinels, a grim-faced wolf named Marius, dared to enter his chambers. "Alpha Kael," he said, his voice low and urgent. "A report from the border." Kael turned, his eyes wild. "What is it?" "Alpha Lucian and a contingent of his warriors have made camp just beyond the river," Marius reported, his gaze steady despite Kael's unhinged appearance. "They are not hostile, but they are not leaving." Kael's fists clenched. "Lucienne." "And the healer, Aria," Marius continued, choosing his words carefully. "She was seen leaving the Packlands an hour ago. She was walking toward the river, toward their camp." The words cut through the chaotic storm in Kael's mind with the clean, sharp edge of a blade. The voices, the visions, the spiraling madness, it all went silent. It was replaced by a single, terrifyingly calm and absolute thought. Mine, the self-loathing, the fear, the guilt. It all burned away, leaving behind the pure, cold steel of an alpha's possessive instinct. He would not let her run from him. He would not let another male claim what the goddess herself had decreed was his. And he would be damned if he let the monster inside him be the reason he lost her. His purpose, once fractured, was now terrifyingly singular. He looked at Marius, and for the first time in days, his eyes were clear. They were the color of a winter storm, and they held the promise of utter devastation. "Ready my patrol," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal growl. "We ride." He had to get to her, not just before Lucienne did. He had to get to her before the darkness inside him did. It was no longer a retreat, it was a race. Chapter 13. A confession in Silverlight Sleep was no longer a place of ambush. It was a sanctuary she now sought with purpose. Aria lay on her cot, the chaos of the last few days settling into a quiet, steely resolve. The diary had given her context. Her own power had given her strength. But she still needed the one thing only he could give her: the truth. Closing her eyes, She didn't fall into the dream. She walked into it, her will a guiding light. The silver forest welcomed her. He was already there, standing by a stream whose water flowed like liquid starlight. He looked tormented, his shoulders slumped, a man carrying the weight of a dying dynasty. He turned as she approached, his winter-gray eyes filled with a familiar agony. This time she did not flinch from his gaze. She walked right up to him, the soft, mossy ground muffling her steps. "You rejected me," she said, her voice clear and strong, without a trace of its old timidity. "You shamed me in front of everyone we know, but your wolf never stopped marking me. It never let me go." She looked him directly in the eye, her own power humming just beneath her skin. "Why?" He flinched, the simple question striking him with more force than a physical blow. He turned away, his broad back a wall of conflicted muscle. "It's not that simple." "Isn't it?" she pressed, stepping beside him and placing a hand on his arm. The contact was a jolt of pure energy in the dreamscape, a current of truth passing between them. "I know about the darkness in your bloodline, Kael. I know what you're fighting." His composure finally broke. He spun to face her, his face a mask of desperation and pain. "Then you know why I did it," he rasped, his voice breaking. "That darkness, it feeds on connection, on emotion. When I saw the light connect us, I felt it stir. It was hungry. All I could think was that this bond, this beautiful, terrifying thing, would be the very thing that turned me into the monster I've spent my whole life trying to cage. I thought I was protecting you." He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face, trembling. "I didn't reject you, Aria. I was trying to save you, from me." The confession hung in the silent silver air, raw and vulnerable. All the anger, all the hurt in her heart, dissolved in the face of his tortured truth. He wasn't a cruel tyrant. He was a terrified man who had chosen to wound her in order to save her. She closed the distance between them, her own hand rising to cover his. "You're not a monster," she whispered. He finally surrendered. With a choked sob, he pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him. His embrace wasn't one of passion, but of desperate, soul-deep relief. It was the embrace of a man who had been drowning alone in the dark and had just found a flicker of light. He buried his face in her hair, his body shaking. Mine, his wolf, Fenrir, whispered in the depths of their shared consciousness. But the word was different now. It was not a command. It was a prayer. It was a promise. Aria held him tight, a feeling of rightness settling over her, a sense of peace she had never known. Her own wolf, timid but true, whispered back in the quiet of their souls. "Yours." They woke at the same instant, in their own separate, lonely beds. But something was different. A strange, warm tingling spread across the skin over their hearts. Aria pushed aside the collar of her tunic and gasped. Kael, miles away in his cold stone chambers, stared into a polished shield, his breath catching in his throat. There, on their skin, a delicate, shimmering pattern had bloomed. It was a swirling silver tracery, like a tattoo made of captured moonlight. It was intricate, beautiful, and undeniably magical. The mark of their bond, once an invisible curse, was now visible for all the world to see. There was no more hiding. Chapter 14. The mark and the mob chaos erupted with the morning sun. A she-wolf delivering clean linens to Kael's chambers saw the mark on his chest, and her scream echoed through the stone halls. Within the hour, the entire pack was buzzing with the news. The mark of the witch, the brand of the outcast. 2 stone-faced warriors appeared at Aria's den. They didn't speak, simply grabbed her by the arms and dragged her out into the daylight. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the newfound peace in her heart. She was marched to the great hall, the whispers and glares of her packmates like 1,000 tiny cuts against her skin. The hall was filled, the pack a restless, murmuring mob. On the raised dais, sat the elders and a grim-faced Alpha Valerius. His eyes, when they landed on Aria, were chips of ice. "Behold!" Valerius thundered, his voice booming through the cavernous room. He pointed a damning finger at her. "The source of our troubles! This witch, this half-blood has ensnared my son with her dark magic." He ripped a piece of parchment from an elder's hand. "Reports of increased rogue activity since the night of the ceremony. The Alpha heir, distracted and unstable. She is not a blessing from the goddess. She is a curse that will be the undoing of us all." The crowd roared in agreement. They were scared. The rogue threat was real, and they needed someone to blame. Aria, the outsider, the mistake, was the perfect target. "She must be cast out," an elder shouted. "Let the rogues have her." The mob surged, their faces twisted with fear and hatred. Aria shrank back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was alone, completely and utterly alone. "Enough!" The voice cut through the din like a whip crack. The crowd parted, a wave of bodies receding from a shore of pure, unadulterated fury. Kael strode through the hall, his eyes blazing with a cold fire that promised death to anyone who stood in his way. He didn't stop until he reached the dais, placing himself directly in front of Aria, shielding her with his body. The mob fell silent. He faced his father, his expression one of calm, lethal defiance. "You are a fool, old man." Valerius's face purpled with rage. "You dare!" "I dare." Kael cut him off. With a slow, deliberate movement, he unlaced the front of his leather tunic, baring his chest to the hall. The silver mark over his heart shimmered in the torchlight, an exact mirror of the one on Aria's skin. A collective gasp rippled through the pack. "If she is cursed, then I am cursed with her," Kael declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "This is not a witch's brand. This is the mark of the goddess. A mark I was a fool to deny." He turned his head slightly, his gaze finding Aria's. The look in his eyes was a vow. "I will not deny her again." He faced the pack, his chin high. "She is my mate. Anyone who dares to lay a hand on her will answer to me." A blinding flash of pure silver light erupted from the center of the hall, throwing everyone back a step. The light was so bright it was painful, and from within it, a voice spoke. A voice that was everywhere and nowhere at once. A voice of chiming glass and ancient stone that every single wolf knew belonged to the moon goddess. "The bond has been accepted. The vessel is prepared." The light focused on Kael and Aria, pinning them in its divine spotlight. Under the blood moon, which rises in 2 nights' time, the price for purification must be paid. A soul for a soul. One must die. The light vanished as quickly as it had appeared, plunging the hall back into torchlit gloom. But the chilling ultimatum remained, hanging in the air like a death sentence. Chapter 15. A vow of poison and pen, a soul for a soul. The goddess's words were a final, terrible judgment. The pack was thrown into a state of fearful confusion, but for Aria, the path forward was terrifyingly clear. She looked at Kael, at the fierce, protective man who had just defied his entire world for her. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that his life, his future as the Alpha their pack desperately needed, was worth more than hers. Her life had been one of service and shadows. If it ended in an act of service that would save him, then it was a life that had purpose. She spent the next day in the quiet solitude of her den, a strange, serene peace settling over her. Her purpose was a shield against fear. She moved with a calm deliberation, sorting through her herbs. Her hands, which had trembled with terror just days before, were now steady as she selected her ingredients. Not the gentle healing herbs she knew so well, but their dark cousins, wolfsbane, nightshade, hemlock. She ground them together with a mortar and pestle, the motion rhythmic, almost meditative. She was not creating a poison. She was crafting a key to his salvation. As dusk began to settle, she took out a small, worn piece of parchment and a charcoal stick, She needed him to understand. "Kael," she wrote, her script clear and steady. "Do not grieve. The goddess requires a soul, and mine has always been forfeit. My whole life I believed love was a debt to be paid through pain. I was wrong. True love is a gift, given freely. And this is my gift to you. You were never the monster. You were a man fighting a war no one else could see. Now the war is over. Live a long life. Be the great alpha you were always meant to be. This is not your debt to pay. It is my choice. Yours, Aria." She folded the note and placed it beside the small dark vial of concentrated poison, hiding them both beneath the loose floorboard. Her final act would be tonight, while the pack slept. Kael found her later, by the stream at the edge of the woods. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. She looked peaceful, and it terrified him. "We'll find another way," he said, his voice urgent, his hand gripping her arm gently. "There has to be another way." She just smiled, a sad, knowing expression on her face. "The goddess has spoken, Kael. All we can do is trust in her wisdom." The calm acceptance in her voice was a wall he couldn't seem to break through. It haunted him. Later that night, as the moon began its ascent, he found himself pacing, the memory of her unnatural serenity replaying in his mind. It wasn't acceptance. It was resignation. A sudden, terrible suspicion took root in his heart. He ran to her den. It was empty. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He tore the small space apart, his mind racing. The herbs, the way she looked at them. He overturned her cot, his hands searching desperately. And then he saw it. The floorboard that wasn't quite right. He ripped it from the floor. He saw the note first. He read the words, and his world, which had only just begun to find its footing, shattered into a million pieces. Her love, her sacrifice, her final, heartbreaking absolution. It was a blow that leveled the last walls of his pride. He was left with nothing but the raw, gaping wound of what she intended to do for him. Then he saw the vial. With a roar of pure anguish, he grabbed it and crushed it in his fist. The glass bit deep into his palm, but he didn't feel the pain. All he felt was the searing, absolute certainty of his own purpose. She would not do this. He would not let her. He was the one with the darkness in his blood. This was his debt to pay. He would find a way to take her place. The goddess wanted a soul. He would gladly give her his. Chapter 16. The Price of Blood. The note and the shattered vial lay on the floor of Aria's den, a testament to a love so fierce it would choose self-destruction. A cold, frantic dread seized Kael, propelling him out into the night. He had to find her. He had to stop her. He ran, not as an alpha heir, but as a man racing against a fate he had only just begun to understand. He burst into the main square, his eyes scanning wildly, expecting to find her already gone. Instead, he found his path blocked by his father's personal guard. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a wall of grim-faced warriors. Behind them stood Alpha Valerius, his expression carved from stone. "Let me pass," Kael growled, his voice a low threat. "You will go nowhere," Valerius stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The pack is in turmoil. The goddess has given us a solution, a sacrifice. It is for the good of the pack, Kael, and for your own good. We will not let a witch's curse destroy our future." The words were a death sentence. "You can't," Kael breathed, shaking his head in disbelief. "She is my mate." "She is a contamination," his father corrected coldly. "One we will now purge." At his signal, the guards moved in. Kael fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, but he was outnumbered and taken by surprise. They were his packmates, his friends, and they forced him to his knees, binding his arms with thick iron chains. As they dragged him toward the dungeons, the ceremonial drums began to beat, a slow, deep, mournful rhythm that was the sound of his world ending. He was chained to the stone wall, the cold iron biting into his wrists. He could hear the pack gathering in the distance, their somber chants carrying on the night air. He roared her name until his throat was raw, pulling against the chains until his skin split and bled, but the iron held fast. He was an alpha, a warrior, a king in waiting, and he was utterly, hopelessly powerless. Aria stood by the stream, the small vial of poison cool in her palm. The moonlight shone down on her, and she felt a strange calm. This was her choice, her sacrifice, her final act of love. She took a deep breath, steeling her resolve. Before the vial could touch her lips, shadows detached themselves from the surrounding trees. The elders of the pack, their faces grim and resolved, surrounded her. "The goddess demands a soul," the eldest of them said, his voice heavy with a sense of righteous purpose. "You will not deny the pack its salvation." She didn't fight as they took the vial from her and bound her hands. In a way, it was a relief. Her own hand might have faltered. Theirs would not. They were leading her to the same fate she had chosen for herself. As they marched her toward the clearing, she felt a flicker of surprise. Just before they'd found her, in a moment of desperate certainty, she had managed to unstopper the vial and swallow a mouthful of the bitter liquid. Her own plan was already in motion. One way or another, the goddess would have her price. In the dungeon, Kael's despair finally broke him. The last vestiges of his rigid control, of the man he thought he was, shattered. He threw his head back, and the sound that ripped from his chest was not a man's scream of anguish. It was the long, soul-tearing howl of a wolf whose mate was being stolen from the world. A wave of raw, primal power exploded from him, and deep in the darkness of the cell, his eyes began to glow a solid, burning gold. Chapter 17. The Monster in His Eyes. The world dissolved into a storm of red-tinged fury. Thought ceased to exist. Logic, reason, love, grief, they were all burned away, leaving only a single primal instinct. Mine, hurt, find. The iron chains were brittle twigs. The stone wall was dust. The guards were insignificant obstacles. He was not Kael anymore. He was Fenrir. He was the darkness in the Thorn bloodline given form, a beast of legend unleashed not by a pact for power, but by the agony of a broken heart. He was a force of nature, a shadow of claws and teeth moving through the packlands like a plague. Warriors who had trained with him their whole lives were thrown aside like broken dolls, their bones snapping under his immense power. He was not their alpha. He was their apocalypse, and he was moving toward the sound of the drums. Aria stood before the great moonstone, the same place her heart had been publicly shattered. The elders were tying her wrists to the cold, obsidian-like surface. Alpha Valerius stood before her, holding a ceremonial knife, its blade carved from a shard of volcanic glass. The drums beat a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The pack watched, their faces a mixture of fear and grim necessity. She felt the poison she had taken beginning its work, a slow, creeping cold spreading from her stomach. Her sacrifice would be completed, with or without their ritual. She closed her eyes, ready. And then the screams began. Panic erupted at the edge of the clearing. Pack members scattered, shouting in terror. Aria's eyes snapped open just as a monstrous black wolf, larger and more terrifying than anything she had ever imagined, burst through the trees. It was a creature of nightmare, its fur matted with blood, its golden eyes burning with an unholy light. It was him. The elders and even Valerius scrambled back in terror, abandoning the ritual, abandoning her. She was left alone, tied to the stone, as the great beast stalked into the center of the clearing. It ignored everyone else. Its burning golden eyes were fixed only on her. This was not a monster. The thought was a moment of perfect, heartbreaking clarity. This was Kael's pain. This was his love, and his despair twisted into a form so powerful it had broken the world. He was a symphony of agony, and she was the only one who could hear the music. The beast padded toward her, a low, rumbling growl shaking the very ground beneath her feet. It stopped just before her, its massive head level with hers. Its hot, ragged breath washed over her face, smelling of blood and the wild, clean scent of pine. She did not scream. She did not struggle. In a voice that was barely a whisper, a soft, gentle sound in the sudden, terrified silence, she spoke the only name that mattered. Kael. The great beast froze. The killing rage in its golden eyes faltered, replaced by a vast, deep, animal bewilderment. Its head tilted, as if trying to understand the word, as if hearing an echo from a life it had just destroyed. Slowly, her own movements made sluggish by the encroaching poison, she leaned forward as far as her bonds would allow. She closed her eyes and pressed a gentle, loving kiss to his blood-flecked muzzle. The monster in his eyes went utterly still. Chapter 18. A tear of starlight. The simple act of love, of acceptance offered to the raging beast, was the last thing her failing body could withstand. The poison she had swallowed, a potent, fast-acting blend of wolfsbane and nightshade, surged through her system, its icy tendrils gripping her heart. The world, which had been sharp and terrifyingly clear, dissolved into a dizzying gray blur. Her legs buckled, and she sagged against the ropes that held her to the moonstone, her strength gone. She could feel her life unraveling, the thread that tied her to the world growing thin. A vast, cosmic pressure descended upon the clearing. It was not a physical presence, but a palpable weight, a cold and impartial entity arriving to collect its due. The moon goddess was here to claim the promised soul. Seeing her collapse shattered Fenrir's hold. The monstrous rage was doused by a wave of cold, sharp terror. Kael was back, a horrified prisoner in a body that was still more wolf than man. He lunged forward, not with aggression, but with desperation, tearing at the ropes with his claws until she was free. He gathered her limp, fragile body into his arms, collapsing to his knees on the cold, hard ground. "No," he begged, the word a broken human sound torn from a beast's throat. He cradled her to his chest, the size and power of his form a stark contrast to her stillness. "Aria, no, please don't leave me." She looked up at him, her vision fading. She could see the man through the monster, the soul through the storm. She could feel her own spirit being pulled away, summoned by a power far greater than his. This was the end. She had done it. She had saved him. A strange, sad peace settled over her. The debt was paid. He held her close, his face buried in her hair, his massive body racked with silent, ragged sobs. All his power, all his strength, all the fury of his wolf, it was all useless. He had fought his father, he had fought his pack, he had fought the darkness inside him, and he had still failed to protect the one thing that mattered. He had lost. With the last ounce of her strength, she lifted a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against his furred cheek. A single tear, born not of fear or pain, but of a love so complete it welcomed oblivion, slipped from the corner of her eye. It was a tiny, perfect drop of mortal sorrow, and it fell, tracing a path through the blood and dirt on his muzzle. It landed directly on the shimmering silver mark that lay hidden beneath the dark fur over his heart. For a breathtaking, impossible instant, the mark did not just shimmer, it blazed. It erupted with a brilliant white light as pure and clean as a newborn star. The light was not hot, it was warm, and it pulsed outward, a wave of life and love that pushed back against the encroaching darkness, that defied the cold, cosmic pressure of the goddess herself. It was a single, impossible spark of hope in the heart of absolute despair. Chapter 19. One Soul, Two Hearts. The light was not a fire, it was a flood. It poured from the mark on Kael's chest, a torrent of pure white energy that washed away the poison in Aria's veins and pushed back the cold, cosmic presence of the goddess. It was not a light to be seen but to be felt, a resurrection of the soul that pulled them both from the precipice of oblivion. They left the cold clearing, the blood moon, and their broken bodies behind, and found themselves standing together in the silver forest. This was their sanctuary, the dreamscape where their bond had first taken root, but it was different now. More real. The air was thick with the scent of living things, The starlight filtering through the leaves was warm, and the soft moss beneath their feet felt like velvet. Aria looked down at her hands. They were whole, her skin glowing with a faint, healthy luminescence. The poison was gone. Kael stood before her, no longer a monster of rage, but a man, his winter-gray eyes clear and filled with a raw, wondering awe. Two wolves emerged from the shimmering trees. One was Fenrir, a magnificent beast of midnight fur and raw power. The other was a creature of moonlight and shadow, a slender she-wolf with silver-gray fur and Aria's own resilient eyes. This was her wolf, her spirit, finally whole and unafraid. The two great animals did not circle each other. They moved as if drawn by a force older than time, pressing their sides together, their forms blurring and melting into one another until they vanished, their combined essence sinking back into Aria and Kael. And then, their minds merged. There were no words. There was only knowing. He felt the crushing weight of her entire life, the loneliness, the yearning to be seen, the quiet resilience of a soul that refused to be extinguished. She felt the terrible burden of his bloodline, the cold, insidious whisper of the darkness, the constant, exhausting battle for control, the terror of becoming the tyrant his ancestors had been. She felt his shame at the rejection, and he felt her agony in receiving it. All pride, all fear, all misunderstanding was burned away in an instant of perfect, absolute empathy. They were not a man and a woman anymore. They were not an alpha and a healer. They were two halves of a single soul that had finally, after a lifetime of searching, found its missing piece. Aria reached out and placed her hand over his heart, where the physical mark lay. Kael covered her hand with his own. They felt two heartbeats perfectly in sync, beating as one. The goddess was not sentencing us, Kael's thought bloomed in her mind, as clear as her own. She was asking a question. She was testing us, Aria's thought answered in his. A soul for a soul. She was asking if we were willing to become one. Their separate, desperate plans to die for each other had been the answer. Sacrifice was the key that had unlocked the final door of the bond. They were no longer bound by the goddess's grim equation, because they were no longer two separate souls. They looked up, and through the silver canopy of the dream forest, they could see the real world hanging like a blood-red jewel in the sky. The blood moon. The ritual was not over. The goddess was still waiting for her price. But they would not face her as beggars pleading for their lives. They would face her together, as a single, unified being, to rewrite the ending of their story. Kael took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. They turned their combined gaze toward the crimson moon, their hearts serene, their souls fearless. It was time to return. Chapter 20. The Blood Moon Reckoning. They opened their eyes to a world drenched in blood. The light of the crimson moon painted the clearing, the trees, and the horrified faces of the pack in a terrifying scarlet glow. Kael was still on his knees, holding Aria in his arms. But she was no longer limp. She was strong, her eyes clear and bright. They rose to their feet as one, their movements perfectly synchronized. The cold, immense pressure of the goddess descended again, a tangible weight that made the air crackle and the stones groan. She was here to collect her debt. The pack cowered, their faces pale with terror. But Aria and Kael did not bow. They stood together, hand in hand, and faced the heavens. The silver marks on their chests blazed to life, no longer separate tattoos but two ends of a single brilliant constellation. A visible arc of pure white light connected them, a bridge of power between their two hearts. The goddess unleashed her will. It was not a physical attack, but a wave of pure, cosmic force, the power that dictates endings, that governs decay and entropy. It was a pressure designed to unmake a mortal soul, to simply command it to cease. Kael roared, a sound of pure, defiant power. He planted his feet, his muscles bulging, and poured every ounce of his alpha strength, his primal connection to the earth, into a shield of pure will. He was the anchor. He was the wall against the storm. The goddess's power crashed against his shield, and he held, gritting his teeth as the immense force threatened to tear him apart. The shield gave her the time she needed. Aria closed her eyes, not in fear, but in focus. She was a healer. This was her purpose. She reached into the core of their now unified soul, to the very heart of their bond. Inside that magical vessel, she could feel it. The centuries of darkness, the cold, corrupting poison of Kael's bloodline writhing like a nest of snakes. She did not fight it. She healed it. Guided by the knowledge from her mother's diary and the pure instinct of her own witch blood, she began to pour her light into that darkness. It was not an attack, but a purification. She channeled the selfless love from her tear, the fierce loyalty of her wolf, and the gentle strength of her own spirit into the corrupting poison. She was a river of light washing away an ancient stain. The battle was cataclysmic. The world seemed to shake as light and shadow warred within their bond. The crimson light of the moon flickered and pulsed. Kael groaned under the strain of holding back the goddess, his face beaded with sweat. Aria trembled, the effort of the purification draining her life force at a terrifying rate. The darkness fought back, clinging to life, but her light was relentless. It was the light of a love that had faced oblivion and not flinched. Finally, with a great, silent scream of energy that ripped through the clearing and made every wolf cry out, the darkness was not just purged. It was unmade. It dissolved into nothingness, erased forever by the pure, unrelenting power of their sacrifice. The instant the darkness vanished, the cosmic pressure of the goddess receded. The battle was over, but the purification had come at a cost. The immense magical backlash, with nothing left to fight, snapped back toward its source. The world went utterly still. The shield of Kael's will collapsed. His strength finally spent, his soul finally free. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Chapter 21. The Scent of Starlight. The silence that fell over the clearing was absolute. The angry crimson glare of the blood moon softened, its light fading to a gentle pearlescent white, as if the moon itself was sighing in relief. The curse was broken. The ancient darkness that had plagued the Thorn bloodline for generations was gone. They had won. But victory was a hollow, heartbreaking thing. Aria stood over Kael's unconscious form. The brilliant light connecting them now faded to a soft shimmer. The purification had taken everything from her. She had poured not just her magic, but her very life essence into cleansing the curse. She felt it now, the great, empty void where her strength used to be. Kael stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked up at her, his winter-gray eyes clear and free of shadow for the first time. He saw her, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. "Aria," he breathed, his voice filled with a love so profound it was a physical presence. She smiled back, a sad, gentle smile. "You're free," she whispered, her voice as faint as a rustling leaf. He pushed himself up, his eyes widening as he truly saw her. Her form was no longer solid. She was becoming translucent, her edges blurring into the soft moonlight, her body slowly losing its substance. He scrambled to his feet and rushed to her, gathering her into his arms. She felt weightless, like holding a memory. "No," he choked out, his voice thick with a sudden, horrifying panic. "No. We won. We did it. You can't leave me now." "The price was paid," she murmured, her form growing fainter, more ethereal. She lifted a shimmering, semi-transparent hand and touched the silver mark on his chest. "The darkness is gone. My purpose is fulfilled." The pack, which had watched the entire cosmic battle in stunned, terrified silence, began to creep out from the edges of the forest. They saw their alpha heir whole and unburdened. They saw the healer, fading in his arms like a dying star. And they finally understood. They saw Alpha Valerius on his knees, his face buried in his hands, his body shaking with the sobs of a father who had almost orchestrated the damnation of his own son. The pack members lowered their heads, not in submission to an alpha, but in reverence to a love and a sacrifice that had just saved them all. "Stay with me," Kael begged, tears streaming down his face as he clutched her tighter, as if his sheer will could hold her together. "I love you," she murmured, her voice the last soft breath of a fading echo. Her beautiful, sad smile was the last thing he saw clearly. And then, she was gone. Her body dissolved completely into 1,000 points of soft, silver light. They lingered in his arms for a moment, a cascade of captured starlight before floating gently up into the night sky and vanishing. All that was left was the lingering warmth in his empty arms and the faint, heartbreaking scent of moon petals. He was alone. The pack was saved, the curse was broken, and the silence in his soul was absolute. Chapter 22. To Mark or to Die. The last of her light was fading in his arms, a dying star returning to the cold, empty void. Kael held the fading essence of her, a scent of moon petals and a lingering warmth, and he screamed at the silent, watching sky. He screamed at the goddess who had demanded this price, his voice a raw, broken thing. "You wanted a soul. Was hers not enough? Then take mine. Give her back." His desperate plea was met with the cold, indifferent twinkle of the stars. The goddess was a force of nature, not a merchant to be bargained with. He could feel Aria's spirit, a fragile wisp being pulled away from him, dissolving into the cosmic tide. Despair, absolute and crushing, washed over him. But in the heart of that despair, a final, defiant spark of his alpha will refused to be extinguished. If the goddess would not answer, he would forge his own fate. He looked down at the last, faint shimmer of her soul still clinging to him. He could not force her to stay, but he could give her a reason, an anchor, an ultimatum. With a surge of desperate strength, he pulled her fading spiritual form against his chest, cradling the light as if it were a newborn child. He tilted his own head back, baring the strong, vulnerable column of his throat to the night. "Aria," he commanded, his voice no longer begging, but ringing with the raw power of a king making his final decree. "You will not leave me. You will finish what we started. You will complete this bond." He pressed her light form closer to his neck, his entire being focused on this one, final, impossible act. "Mark me," he growled, his voice thick with unshed tears and unwavering resolve. "Claim me as yours, and use my life force to live. Or kill me now and let our souls be destroyed together." He closed his eyes, his voice dropping to a fierce, ragged whisper. "I will not live in a world you are not in." For a moment, there was nothing. Only the cold night air and the fading of her light. Then, he felt it. A hesitation, a gathering of will. The light in his arms pulsed, then solidified for a breathtaking instant. He felt the ghostly presence of her face, her breath, her resolve. And then, a sharp, painless pressure on his throat. He felt the phantom sensation of her teeth sinking into his flesh. Not an act of violence, but an act of creation. It was a mirror of the first dream, of the first mark, but this time it was not his wolf claiming her. It was her soul claiming his. A final, mutual surrender. An explosion of silent white light erupted from the point of contact. It was not a physical light, but a soul-deep fire that consumed them both. Their two silver marks on his chest and in her spirit blazed as one. Their souls, one already half gone and the other offered freely in its place, crashed into each other. They did not just connect. They merged. They fused. They became something new. Something the goddess, in all her ancient wisdom, had never anticipated. High in the star-dusted heavens, a single silent tear of pure starlight was seen falling from the sky. The goddess had not been defeated. Her test had simply been answered with a love so absolute it had broken all the rules. Chapter 23. The Alpha and the Silence. Kael woke to the gentle sound of birdsong. A soft, gray morning light was filtering through the trees, and the air was cool and clean. For a moment, he was utterly disoriented. He was lying on the soft moss of the clearing, the moonstone cool and silent beside him. He sat up, his body aching but whole. He was human. He reached inward, searching for the familiar, primal presence that had been his constant companion, his strength, and his curse for his entire life. He reached for Fenrir. There was nothing. Only a profound, peaceful silence he had never known. The raging fire, the constant battle for control, the whispers of the ancient darkness, all gone. In their place was a vast, serene quiet. The wolf was not dead. Kael understood somehow. Fenrir had been integrated, his essence woven into the very fabric of their newly merged soul. He was a part of Kael and a part of Aria, forever. Kael scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding with a new, desperate hope. He looked around the clearing, his eyes searching frantically. Aria? She was not there. The clearing was empty. The scent of moon petals was gone, carried away on the morning breeze. He was alone. He stumbled back to the packlands as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The pack members who saw him stopped and stared, their expressions a mixture of awe, confusion, and fear. He was their alpha, the savior who had faced down a goddess, but he was changed. The dangerous, predatory energy that had always clung to him was gone, replaced by a deep, sorrowful stillness. He saw his father standing near the Great Hall. Alpha Valerius looked like a man who had aged 100 years in a single night. His face was a mask of shame and a terrible, dawning regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but Kael simply walked past him, his gaze fixed forward. There was nothing to say. There was no anger left in him, no desire for vengeance or forgiveness. There was only the great, hollow cavern in his heart where Aria used to be. The day passed in a haze. He moved through his duties with a clarity and focus he had never possessed before. Without the internal war to distract him, his mind was sharp, his decisions swift and sure. He was the alpha his pack needed. He was a leader, but he was a king ruling over an empty kingdom. That night, the silence of his chambers was a crushing weight. He had never felt so utterly alone. The quiet in his mind, once a desperate wish, was now a torment. He fell into an exhausted, dreamless sleep, expecting nothing but the suffocating darkness of his grief. Instead, he found himself standing in a familiar forest, its trees shimmering with a soft, silver light. And for the first time since she had vanished in his arms, he heard a sound that was not a memory. It was distant, but clear as a silver bell, echoing through the moonlit woods. It was her laughter. Chapter 24, Running with the Moon. The dreamscape was his true reality now. The waking world was a duty, a responsibility he would honor for her sake. But the silver forest was his life. Every night, the moment sleep claimed him, he was there. Every night, he ran through the shimmering trees and soft, mossy clearings, a lonely hunter searching for the source of a beautiful, elusive melody. He followed the sound of her laughter, a sound that was both a balm to his soul and a constant, aching reminder of what he had lost. He was an alpha who commanded a loyal pack by day, but he was a ghost haunting his own heart by night. Tonight felt different. The air in the forest was charged with a new energy, a warmth that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the woods. The sound of her laughter was not a distant echo, but a close, joyful presence, as if she were just beyond the next silver birch. He ran faster, his heart pounding with a hope he had been too afraid to truly embrace. He rounded a familiar bend near the starlit stream, and then he stopped, his breath catching in his throat. She was there. She was standing on the bank of the stream, her bare feet touching the glowing water. She was not a spirit. She was not a memory. She was solid, real, and more radiant than any sunrise. Her simple, homespun tunic had been replaced by a gown that seemed woven from moonlight itself, and her dark hair was unbound, flowing down her back. She turned to him, and her smile was the single most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Beside her, sitting with a calm and regal poise, was a magnificent wolf. Its greatcoat was a breathtaking, swirling mix of Fenrir's midnight black and her own spirit's shimmering silver. Its eyes were not gray, not gold, but a soft, warm hazel that held the combined wisdom of both their souls. It was their bond-given form, their spirit, their eternal companion. Kael couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He could only stare, his heart, which he thought had been shattered beyond repair, beginning to piece itself back together. This was not a dream. This was their world, the home their souls had built together. He finally took a step forward, and then another, until he was standing before her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. She reached out and took his hand. It was solid. It was warm. It was real. The feeling of her touch was a homecoming so profound it brought tears to his eyes. She smiled, a gentle, teasing light in her eyes that was all Aria. "You thought I'd let you run alone?" she asked, her voice the music that had been guiding him through his darkness. He finally found his own voice, a rough, emotional whisper. "I thought I'd lost you." "You can never lose me," she said softly, her fingers lacing with his. "You hold half of my soul, and I hold half of yours." He led a pack of wolves in a world of sun and shadow. She ruled a silent, beautiful kingdom of moonlight and starlight. They could not walk together in the waking world, but here, in the sanctuary they had earned with their sacrifice, they would never be apart. He was the Alpha by day, and she was his Luna by night. He pulled her close, and for the first time since he had been born, Kael Thorne was not just free, he was whole. Together, hand in hand, with their spirit wolf rising to stand beside them, they walked along the banks of the starlit stream, two souls running together beneath an eternal benevolent moon.